yeah, I suppose Estonia is not really a country that is that receives a lot of attention in the media or by scholars, but its struggle against an increasingly powerful far right and authoritarian neoliberalism is definitely a crucial topic and very much connected to many similar developments that we've seen across Europe. And yeah, really looking forward to Jokubas' presentation on this, as well as the discussants afterwards, Yuliya, Yurchenko, and Owen. And yeah, I think we'll start with the presentation. So yeah, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for this introduction, and hello, everyone. I will try to share my screen now. Hopefully you can hear me okay, and there are no problems with sound. And hopefully you can also see my screen. First of all, allow me to say thank you for your kind invitation to this workshop. I have been following the CEPR network since the start of my PhD studies at the University of Nottingham. And the work of network's members has been really a major inspiration for my own thinking about global political economy and about critical political economy more specifically. So I'm delighted to be here and also see some familiar names and faces. As for today's presentation, it will essentially summarize the main claims that I make in my recent article titled The Monoliths of Authoritarianism, Cartographies of Popular Disenfranchisement, and the Ascendance of the Far Right in Estonia. As has been mentioned, this article was published in the first issue of a recently launched Global Political Economy journal. So I should really begin by saying that for someone who has been studying the political economy of the three Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, for a good while now, the events of March 2019 were distressing, if not entirely unexpected. Basically, in March 2019, Estonia held its parliamentary elections, and the Conservative Party, Conservative People's Party of Estonia, ACRE, came third. It gained almost a fifth of the popular vote, approximately 18%. Now, we can provisionally define ACRE as a far-right party whose ideology revolves around nativism, xenophobia, racism, Euroscepticism, and populism. Now, prior to the parliamentary elections in 2019, the polls clearly indicated that this relatively new far-right party, founded in 2012, would do quite well. However, very few, if any, observers actually expected it to come third. Moreover, virtually no one predicted that soon after the far-right party would come to form the coalition government with the center-left party called the Centre Party and the Christian Democratic National Conservative Party called Isamaa. While ACRE was part of this coalition government in Estonia for less than 2 years, it is currently the second most popular party in Estonia, and the next parliamentary election is just around the corner, scheduled for March the 5th. Okay, so in the immediate aftermath of this parliamentary election, I have spent a considerable time reading the accounts in Estonian media that really try to explain the so-called unexpected success of the far right. And for the most part, those accounts pointed to various things, including the incapacity of traditional or mainstream parties to own the issues such as migration, sovereignty, the economy. They also pointed towards the growing distrust of political elites, which is the condition which became quite widespread across East Central Europe. Those accounts also spoke about ACRE's effective campaigning strategies. What should also be noted here is that ACRE's success came at a time when post-communist scholars began to reevaluate the policies of so-called post-communist transition in the 1990s. And they did so against the backdrop of obviously populist backlash, most notably in Hungary and Poland. Liberal scholars such as Ivan Krastev, Jan Zielonka, Milardova Khudova really spoke about something called the democratic backsliding of East Central Europe due to various factors, including, for example, the transition era neglect of collective identities, the institutionalization of elite hegemony over democratic processes, and liberal reformers' sort of apathy towards the democratic deficits of institutions such as the European Union. Now, all of these perspectives or approaches evaluating ECRE's rise are obviously useful, but they are useful to some extent, I claim, in this article. In my view, at least, they provide an incomplete picture of ECRE's electoral success. So what this article really tries to do is it aims to account for the situation in the seldom analyzed case of Estonia, and to do so also from a critical political economy perspective that overcomes, at least in part, hopefully, some of the limitations existing in extant literature. So it seems to me that there are at least three of those potential limitations as far as the study of the far right in Estonia and East Central Europe is concerned. First of all, most thinking on the far right in Estonia suffers from what might be called methodological nationalism. So what remains unexplored, in other words, are the ways in which the international comes to constitute and shape the material and ideological fabric of domestic political life. Second, most literature on the far right in East Central Europe as a whole tends to shy away from analyzing its class-constituted support base. And this can be interpreted in many different ways as far as the reasons for such a move are concerned. But one could perhaps argue that this is indeed a remnant of a long tradition, detectable even in critical political economy scholarship, that sort of conceptualizes historical communism and also the following post-communist transformation as sort of a devoid of class as a necessary analytical category when sort of studying those, both the transition but also sort of late historical communism. So today's analysis of the far right seem to be replicating this kind of analytical move, and they tend to ignore the basis of far right supports that encompass, at least in my view, the sections of the middle class and the sections of the working class. Finally, the more recent corpus around democratic backsliding really tends to operate with an unhelpful dichotomy of authoritarianism on the one hand and liberal democracy on the other. Therefore, the presence of the far-right parties in government is deemed to be a necessary ingredient for coercive and anti-democratic state action. And here I have in mind the separation between the political and the economic spheres of social life. The former, i.e. the political sphere, is where politics asserts itself, be it democratic or authoritarian. And the latter, i.e. the economic sphere, is almost by definition natural, extra-political, neutral, and therefore not really sort of warranting an in-depth investigation. Now, the central prism that informs my inquiry is that of authoritarian neoliberalism. Now, I know that this notion has attracted manifold criticisms, and perhaps we can talk about them in the Q&A session. But put very briefly, this prism, I think, can be used to study the authoritarian bents in state practices that tend to work in tandem with institutions and legal frameworks, sustaining minimalist conceptions of democracy. Here, as the authors of this prism indicate, authoritarianism is not associated with the exercise of brute force as such, but rather it sort of connotes the processes for which capitalist crisis, during the moments of capitalist crisis, we see the configurations of statecraft concerned with insulating certain policies from public control and from dissent. Now, how can this sort of a prism be applied to the case of Estonia and the rise of the far right? I argue that after the 2008 crisis, Estonian political economy has witnessed the rise of resurgent authoritarian neoliberalism. I use the term resurgent because authoritarian bents have already sort of configured the pathways of Baltic neoliberalization or post-communist transformation since the early 1990s. After 2008, however, authoritarian neoliberalism in Estonia came to rest on two novel and sort of interrelated monoliths. I call them the regional monolith and the national monolith. Basically, they stand for sort of two scalarly constitutive elements of this new form of authoritarian neoliberalism. And hopefully the examination of those sort of monoliths helps account for the immediate factors explaining the surge of the far right in Estonia. So let me very briefly sort of unpack them. So the first monolith is the regional monolith, and it has been ingrained in Estonia's entry into the Eurozone and in the emergence of what has been termed the new European economic governance structure. It was this structure that since the 2008 and since the Eurozone crisis, increasingly reconfigured capital-labor relation in favor of the former. And the regional monolith contributed, I show in the article, to the eradication of democratic oversight by Estonian and European electors as well over the decision-making processes of their governments. I illustrate this by looking at the so-called neoliberal country-specific recommendations put forward by the European Commission as part of this European semester. And it becomes clear that the European Commission has been really adamant in its calls for Estonia and for the other two Baltic states to diminish the social safety nets, privatize pension systems, promote marketization in sectors of higher education, electricity, gas, etc., and also to sort of adopt judicial reforms conducive to business sort of friendly legal environments. Now, Estonian state managers seem to have endorsed those recommendations. They have been one of the most vocal advocates for fiscal restraint, especially during the moment of the Eurozone crisis. So they call for fiscal restraint to be imposed very harshly on southern European countries. Liberal politicians, for example, such as the current Prime Minister of Estonia, Kaja Kallas, tended to narrate the sovereign debt crisis in a nationalist lexicon. And paradoxically, such narrations spoke directly to the far-right sensibilities. ECRE, subsequently this far-right party, subsequently exploited and radicalized this nationalist language. The far right has become vocal in opposing Estonia's participation in the European Financial Stability Facility, also in the European Stability Mechanism. It also organized demonstrations and even a referendum campaign on the ratification of the ESM Treaty in the case of Estonia. It obviously also invoked sort of well-known terrible stereotypes of lazy Mediterraneans, spoke about sort of unjustified Estonia's contributions to the Eurozone bailout funds, and also spoke about establishment's inability in Estonia to cater for ordinary citizens. Now, the second monolith, I term it the national monolith. Basically, it refers to the increasing propensities of the capitalist state to restrict the freedoms of gathering and to deploy the measures of intimidation against dissenting publics. And these developments also intensified during the 2008 crisis. So in the article, I chronicle the evolution of Estonia's Public Meetings Act during the 2008 crisis. Several amendments have been introduced to this act, and with the purpose of basically restricting resistance against austerity measures. And this was done sometimes on the most ludicrous grounds, for example, by deeming public gatherings illegal because they might incite sort of a discrimination on the basis of political views, property, or social status. And such sort of a forms of authoritarian state intervention, neoliberal authoritarian state intervention, then contributed to the erosion of public trust on the part of Estonian population. And this is also sort of substantiated by looking at statistical evidence. Now, what does such a reading of ECRE's rise through two monoliths of authoritarian neoliberalism really tells us about the specific case of Estonia? I think there are three broad implications here. So for one, the far right's presence in government is neither a necessary nor a sufficient condition, I claim, when dissecting the authoritarian bents in contemporary Estonia's neoliberal statecraft. Instead, the rise of the far right signifies a reaction to the resolution of crisis in neoliberal terms. It, in a sense, amounts to the response against the regime of capital accumulation already inflected with ever more assertive authoritarian tendencies. Second, and contrary to methodologically nationalist analytical imaginaries, the surge in support for ECRE has been assisted by institutional frameworks of the EU and the Eurozone. So the regional spatial scale really functioned to render the regulation of capitalism increasingly exterior to democratic oversight. It also shaped the contours of domestic politics as far as the discourse on the debt crisis, the Eurozone crisis, is concerned. And finally, as part of this new European economic governance framework or structure, the capitalist state and its personnel were compelled to suppress the outbursts of public discontent. The practices of policing expressions of popular anger against austerity measures contributed to the eradication of public trust and legitimacy. And in this sense, too, the surge in support for the far right has been consequential to, rather than causal of, increasingly coercive modalities of capitalist statecraft. So it is this sort of a scalar political economy of immediate factors conducive to the far right success that remains imperceptible for mainstream accounts, I claim. And finally, apart from studying the immediate factors conducive to ECRE's rise in the conjuncture of 2008 crisis, the article also casts a wider gaze at the politics of disenfranchisement that have their roots in post-communist transformation process. Now, one of the key reasons for ECRE's success is attributable to its capacity to displace the experiences of disenfranchisement onto the signifier of the nation, collective identity of Estonians. In fact, ECRE has actually performed very, very well in poorer, depopulating, and rural constituencies, especially in southern part of the country. At the same time, its stronger constituencies registered the highest rates of material deprivation, unemployment, and poverty rates. But what I also try to show in the article is that we cannot simply explain the rise of the far right in Estonia as some sort of a reaction of so-called ethno-national fault against the so-called cosmopolitan ruling classes, which is sometimes the sort of the framework used, at least in the case of East Central Europe. And sort of populist backlash there. Now, why is that the case? We have to take note of the fact that ECRE has been the most popular political force in the previous parliamentary elections among the youth. So in the age category between 18 and 24 years of age. In that sense, it sort of resembles Geert Wilders' Party of Freedom. In addition to that, ECRE's economic program has been endorsed by the sections of the middle class. And the middle class did so on the grounds of small and medium-sized business difficulties in meeting, for example, the EU directives or the high tax burdens on the self-employed. What was also very attractive were basically the promises, ECRE's electoral promises to repeal 25 most bureaucratic business laws and regulations, improve credit facilities for small and medium-sized enterprises through the creation of the Public Investment Bank, introduce tax incentives promoting life in Estonia's rural peripheries, cease payment increases to the EU budget, and also in public procurement, it's sort of a readiness to prioritize companies based on Estonian capital. So taken together, I show that ECRE has really managed to attract a relatively diverse support base. The latter involves so-called titular working class segments, poverty-stricken pensioners, small and medium business owners, and the youths. This should not necessarily come as a surprise, because far-right's contradictory policy stances regarding its critique of capitalism obviously go back to the fascist tradition. And it is in fact only through such sort of inconsistent approaches in its critique of capitalism that the far right can attempt at exercising the politics of class transcendence and really stand any success at the ballot box. Now, in the final part of the article, I very briefly show how ECRI's inclusion in the coalition government did not really mark any departure from neoliberalism, despite some claims to the contrary, which were made by Estonia's liberal establishment. So I will leave it here, and I would like to thank you all for your attention, and I would be happy to answer some of your questions.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Jokubas. It's a really interesting, really insightful article. I recommend that everyone read it, because it's also open access. So go ahead. So now we'll come to the comments, and first of all, we'll start with Yuliya. Go ahead.
Right. I'm going first, right? Thank you very much for writing this piece, Jokubas, and it's been a pleasure to read it and reflect upon it, and I'm really glad I get to offer some of my reflections on it. Indeed, it's one of those pieces that are really rare and are needed more about post-Soviet space, generally the Baltic countries, of course, in Central and Eastern Europe, not least because we see the rise of the right internationally, and we need to be reminded through these nuanced examples why it's so important to look into the local context, historical, social, class, economic context, in order to understand what we're dealing with and where it's come from. I think you deploy very usefully the framework of authoritarian neoliberalism, while also highlighting the some of the fairer and not very fair criticisms of it. And you show it also, I think another reason why it's not just interesting to read, but very useful for the scholars of this framework of Pulandzas, of Gramsci, those who are trying to, of scholars of the far right, and contemporary forms of capitalism, to look at how those kind of frameworks can be deployed in the without replicating templates, but rather drawing from the material reality of the studied countries is extremely it's extremely fruitful in that sense. So it's a great example to follow. You very masterfully combine the national and the international, and the nuances and importance of those nuances in the domestic context, which again is something that I do not see very often done. Myself, as a PhD student many years ago, I've been yearning for analysis like that. That did not simply borrow frameworks and wholesale transplanted them somewhere, irregardless of what the material reality is, and therefore producing flawed analysis, well, wrong analysis, but actually engaging with the material. So thank you so much for writing it. I found it really illuminating. I do agree with you a lot that there is insufficient attention that's ascribed to the modalities through which the international functions as a source of fear, hostility, and opportunity for the far right, quote unquote. And it is really important looking at how domestic political spaces provide these opportunities and opening bases on the intricacies in which the international comes to constitute the material and ideological fabric of domestic political life. Because indeed, very often when we think about the far right, and we see that in political commentary, we see it in academic commentary. There is very often conflation. There are very often analysis being dispensed that, especially when applied to post-Soviet space, especially to non-Russia countries, to countries other than Russia that are post-Soviet, where nationalisms are being treated like nationalisms of old imperial states. And I think this, I'm really, towards the end of this commentary, I want to invite you to tell us a little bit more about this class dynamic, because I kept thinking through this piece, reading it. What does this, what does this appeal to this, the rise of this party tell us? And the class composition of the base of their support, what do they tell us about the politics that are emerging in Estonia and in the Baltic countries and in Central Eastern European countries and elsewhere? What does that tell us? What does that tell us about the kind of the right that we see around? And what does it tell us about their class base, more importantly? Because we've seen some examples of that in other places, but this one is quite peculiar. I quite liked your analysis of the combination of bourgeois democracies with authoritarian instances, which is something that indeed I agree with you is a kind of gets falsely dichotomized in a lot of analysis that we come across. And you show very clearly through concrete example that no, it's perfectly combinable, and those things can coexist indeed quite well. And actually classical political economists had better ideas about how these things can be combined, but I'm divulging now because I'm teaching on that with my undergraduate students at the moment, so it's kind of on the top of my head. Some of the other very interesting things that I found in your piece is specifically kind of the importance of the defeat of the left in the post-Soviet space, and specifically in some, because I also don't like bulking all of this massive space and countries into one big block, but there's been a historic defeat of the left for very specific historic reasons, a lot of which have this kind of ongoing trajectory and the history of the Russian hegemony and neo-imperialist ambitions in the region that, of course, are now much more reinvigorated, which spells also its own new conditions for potential rebirth, if you like, of the left politics in the region. But specifically, the kind of the historic defeat of the left that create, I really don't like this term, but I can't think of a better one, kind of almost an ideological vacuum, right? In which the right could really thrive in the way that it wasn't the same in Italy or France or Britain. The defeat, the historic defeat and the weakening through the, again, economic material conditions of everyday life, of trade union movement. This kind of break of historic traditions and legacies and solidarities, displacement of people. You talk about these kind of areas where there's been a lot of economic migrants having a lot of support for this party, right? And those are very unique constellations of demographic constellations that are specific to Central Eastern Europe and some other countries that went through this kind of post-Soviet transformation. So it was really interesting and informative to read that and to also kind of start drawing trajectories and parallels with elsewhere in other post-Soviet states with their own local idiosyncrasies as well. I think your talk about this kind of two monoliths of the regional intervention, if you like, not least through the erosion of sovereignty of decision-making in the country through fiscal compact and beyond, is very fruitfully set against the national right rise for the sake of public order. And again, we see that invoked in different places in different ways, but the specifics of how it happened in your case are really informative indeed. And I'm really glad that you discussed it with so much depth. I think overall, the crucial, because I can talk for hours, but I want to kind of leave space for others to talk. Then the crucial importance here that I take away from this article is how important it is to look at the material, concrete, social, economic, and institutional relations in concrete societies and the interplay of the national and the international in them. If one is to understand what and why is happening in that said country, instead of jumping to ready-made conclusions as to what nationalism means, who nationalists are, why they gain popularity, what kind of economic system they will support, right? Those answers are never quite ready. And the right that we see on the rise internationally today is not the same that we have seen 50, 60, 80 years ago. And so these kind of cases that you document are very crucial for our understanding as to why the right and of what kind of ilk is on the rise in the region and internationally as well. So thank you very much for this piece. I've taken a lot of ideas to contemplate from it. And I would invite you to, it's more of an invitation to comment rather than anything else, to tell us where you see, which direction you see the politics moving in the country, whether the left, if you like, especially in the era of this reinvigorated Russian neocolonialism and their discursive appropriation and collation in the kind of neo-historical history, kind of narrative soup of the legacy of Russian imperialism, USSR, and contemporary Russian Federation. Kind of what kind of space, if any, is left for the left in Estonia, and of course with the fiscal compact and all of these different pressures and the socioeconomic pressures on members of various classes, including middle class, as you've yourself highlighted. So thank you so much for this piece, and I look forward to hear what other people have to say. Thank you.
All right, thanks a lot, Yuliya. Excellent comments and really important questions you're raising. Yeah, now we'll move on to Owen's comments.
Hi everyone. I was muted. Apologies if you can't see me very well. I've got a problem with light. I think I've got a problem with connect. I've got a problem with everything. I've got a problem with connection, and my my left ear's all bunged up. So I've got a problem with that as well. There's a question. Don't know if you want to answer the question.
Yeah, Anna, you have an intervention?
Hi, yeah, hi to everyone. Yeah, I would have a question, but I don't know whether Jokubas will first react or we can go with questions.
Maybe let's Owen finish. And
yeah.
That would be good. Okay.
Okay. So if you can't hear me, I apologise. If you can't see me particularly well, I also apologise. And if I'm shouting too much, that's because my left ear's got manky, so I apologise to that as well. But I thank you for the piece. I thank for the chance to respond to this. So I obviously read this in GPE when it came out. It's not so much, I don't really want to say a huge amount to provide any criticism or anything like this on the piece. I think the piece works quite well. I think the way you do it's very good. I think you you situate it quite well around the general sort of working framework of authoritarian neoliberalism as it was sort of perceived post-crisis. Obviously not saying that it is something that has emerged post-crisis, but that it's been discussed post-crisis, and then you utilize this back into Europe and into the case study. I also like the way that you also give some sort of brief discussion on how the far right has been formulated around GPE, starting off with Mark Rupert's book, which certainly to me sort of kick-started a lot of this material back sort of 25 years ago. And then, you know, looking at how this has been sort of forged around the sort of idea, if you like, of neoliberalism co-opting parts of the far right and the far right orchestrating strategies that were very neoliberal in orientation or manage in some way to forge a form of continuity or a form of different form of a protracted form of neoliberal continuity. So all these things are, I think, are good. All I want to really do is sort of pinpoint some things that where you might go from here, some other ideas which you could also say to some of this, and to question some of the direction of your application. On the first side of things, what I would suggest you do is read some of the Russian material, particularly which was written 20 years ago on Russian autocracies. And Boris Kaglitsky wrote a book on, he basically phrased the term neoliberal autocracy. It's the first time I heard that term. Before I reached puberty, I used to write on Russia a long time ago. And then I stopped doing that as soon as I did my PhD on that a long time ago, and that was all the rage at the time. Largely because obviously Russia was having significant problems, as we all know, in the 90s, and Vladimir appeared, and suddenly they embarked upon a number of authoritarian, autocratic forms which had already been there in the Yeltsin era. So that is, and there's a number of work around that at the time from some people who've gone a bit peculiar recently, Alexander Buzgalin and people like that, who is worth looking at, particularly around that sort of framework, which I think will strengthen some of your position. I mean, I know ECRA has got a peculiar view on Russia anyway, in the sense that they quite like Putin at one point, but obviously they've reversed this in the result of the policies and obviously the war. They've sort of backlash against that. So I would be. It would be, I think, useful for you to engage in some of that that stuff on sort of autocracy, which had been done quite a long time ago. The other thing, so that's on that, just on the sort of basis of the sort of authoritarian neoliberal framework. On other points, I just got a number of things to suggest which you might be able to sort of play around with, or just a few sort of wider comments forged around understanding the far right. Now, these are things which might or might not be relevant to ECRA, and so they come a bit. To a degree, you can pick out whether ECRA becomes a more substantial study in one direction, or whether it has some traits that a lot of the sort of transnational far right parties are doing. So first and foremost is that there is hardly any far right parties or populist political parties that they themselves call authoritarian. So in terms of the definition of what authoritarian is, they all claim to be libertarian. Now, some differ, particularly some of those in, I mean, the sort of early 90s, some of the sort of Slavic ones in particular, embraced autocracy, embraced authoritarian, but certainly the large majority proclaim to be libertarian, and particularly proclaim things like freedom of speech, and the sort of Anglo-American bodies at the moment are all embarked on culture wars and various other things, which are quite important here. And it's here where things like Benz's article, material on neoliberal populism is quite interesting, because how populism is then altered around in this peculiarity of which interconnects in a bizarre way with their sort of economic outlook. So it would be interesting to get a little bit more stuff on ECRA. And ECRA is quite interesting because I don't know if you know this, but one of the ECRA was visited in 2000 and I think it was 2015 by UKIP, a delegation, Nigel, etc., who came in and apparently discussed various coherent strategies. The idea of UKIP sitting around the table with Eka it just sounds like a comedy sketch. But they occurred, and as I say, I mean, UKIP themselves at the time were quite prominent. They were running up to the 2015 election, and they were quite, confrontational in terms of their sort of anti-European populism. Economically, they were pretty much still as they are, or as they ended up finishing, quite all over the place. But it is an interest. But certainly, if you use an authoritarianism, again, UKIP very much has embraced this libertarian position. So the sort of peculiar dialectic and the contradictions that are contained within the reality of the processes that led to the far right polity and then the far right themselves, the far right ideology, do play into this. And the other thing which you might want to look at, just to finish off, is some of the work that Adam Harness does here. He was right. He came out with a term which was in Ripe in 2010, I think it was, which he calls it neoliberal nationalism, and he has a typology of neoliberal nationalism. And this was something I did in my book, actually, the intro into my book a few years ago. I sort of combined, I put a collection of sections of where it's interesting if you look at the crossovers between neoliberalism and this sort of far right turn. And I sort of mentioned Ian's stuff on authoritarian neoliberalism and Adams on neoliberal nationalism and Benz's work on sort of neoliberal populism. And also, which you also do put in here, some of Rick Saul's conceptualization. And all of those four are all quite compatible and quite interesting to develop and to look at when you want to develop this further, or when you want to pick out more sort of intricacies within the case study. So I'd just like to really put those down. I certainly thought it was a good piece. I thought it was a very tight piece, very well worked piece. I enjoyed reading it, and it was. These are just things which you can go forward. And I'm certainly not going to accuse you of functionalism or anything like that. For those who can understand that, it's a secret joke. Anyway.
All right. Thanks a lot, Owen. Also very insightful comments. Lots of new readings to do now. With that, we don't have a ton of time for Q&A, but we'll gather as many questions as we can now. And feel free to raise your hands and chime in. I think Anna already started, so let's go ahead with you.
Yeah, hi again. Thank you a lot. Thank you very much for this great presentation. I really enjoy it, even more because it overlaps with my own topic. I'm working on Slovenia, and I saw plenty of parallels. It seems that we share our core hypothesis that the Eurozone crisis was crucial for some kind of authoritarian turn, and then we can debate how we conceptualize this authoritarianism. I would have like 2-3 questions in this little bit implicit comparative perspective. One is, so you said that it is important to focus on the basis of these parties, on the social basis, and the support that the Conservative People's Party have from precarious classes, or like impoverished classes, but also youth and middle classes, like small and medium entrepreneurs. And I was thinking, from where this support comes from. Does it come from their offer, like that this party really offered them some economic and social policy that goes against the previous established one? And in this sense, in a way that it at least partially break, with the pre-crisis neoliberalism, in a way like does Fidesz and PiS, if you know maybe, or actually the support comes more from the, in a way, some kind of punishment of the transitional parties, right? And I think, and from here, my second question would be, to what extent the Conservative People's Party questions the European regulation or the Eurozone on more economic level, especially in terms of the alliances with transnational capital, right? And so what role did it play in this post-crisis accumulation regime, right? Did it, in a way, embrace it? Yeah. So did we see some kind of realignments of the economic policies between different parties that were just formally distinguished themselves, or that they had something to offer? Because at least in Slovenia, it is very obvious that the Eurozone regulations act as a kind of straitjacket, yeah, and the economic and social policies between the ultra far right and the more wannabe centrist parties are, they don't distinguish at all. It's the same program. They have just different perception of, how we should manage the public television and press. But so yeah, so this would be my question. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Anna. I think Andrew, I saw you wave. Did you have a question?
Yes, please. So I'm not an academic. I can't point you towards kind of literatures or anything like that, and I don't have any really technical question. But part of the reason for wanting to come along is that I spent some time in the Baltics, from the late 90s onwards, and I'm this discussion takes me right back to how the political culture was in the 90s. And, this discussion of to what extent is Eastern Europe any different from Western Europe? What forms of xenophobia or forms of racism or forms of other things were at play? And, does that make any difference? It's an interesting idea. Also, it strikes me that massive crisis like 2008, in a way, if you think that there's nothing kind of essentially different about Eastern and Western Europe, then you could set up some comparisons about how populations respond to elite advice and technocratic advice from abroad during a crisis, and what influences people's putting trust in different kinds of answer. It seems to me that young people putting their faith in a very inflexible answer is very different generationally from people washed out with a lot of resignation, cynicism, despair in the generations that lived through Soviet communism. But also maybe some people can't sustain that kind of ironic resignation forever, and eventually these things are very tempting. So I'm partly thinking about not the material side, but what we imagine. I'm partly thinking about counterfactuals, about how receptive would these countries be to a different brand of advice than the advice given in the 90s? Can we imagine people, in a way, does your kind of argument suggest, yeah, they could very well have adapted to a different kind of advice and found it fitted with their culture just as easily or badly as this one? But if all of that is not so helpful, because let's say we're all Europeans could be quite susceptible to a piece of easy, bit of inconsistent, pragmatic prejudice, then another angle of looking at this could be about the scale of these countries. They're small states, and therefore this methodological nationalism seems particularly inappropriate for looking at them. They know they're small states. The way they reason about their sovereignty has always been around being peripheral parts of empires. They know that they were run by, industrial ministries under the Soviet Union. So, passing bits of European agreements without even bothering to read them, in a way you could see that as a continuity with being parts of much larger units. So I don't know if any of that's of interest, but I suppose I have a feeling that those, rather than just the class basis, something about, there could be interesting questions about how people, because after all, populism is a kind of orientation to expertise. It's an orientation to trust and who do you listen to? And the inconsistency is sometimes a kind of form of political naivety. Finally, sorry, I'm going on too long, but the international also applies to the right itself, doesn't it? Because all of this nationalism does have an international complexion at all, and it's so odd, it's so extreme and so inconsistent. It's often not really about just that national unit at all, something bigger. Thanks.
Right, thanks, Andrew. I think Ian, you pulled back your question, so yeah, we can go to responses. So yeah, Jokubas, feel free.
Thank you so much. How much time do I have to respond?
About 3 to 5 minutes, depending on if the others want to chime in as well.
Okay. So thanks a lot for those comments, very insightful comments, I thought. Thanks a lot for your questions as well. I mean, I could detect, I noted some questions, won't be able to answer all of them. Beginning with what Yuliya has said, so I think one of the questions raised there in that contribution, in that commentary was, so what does the example of ECRA tell us about sort of contemporary politics more generally, both in Central and Eastern Europe and perhaps at the European scale, or even global scale? So I think what the example of Estonia shows, and the rise of the far right there shows, is that in the environment where the left has been defeated in the 1990s, in the environment where the left has not yet sort of came back on the political scene, so Estonia, as far as left-wing initiatives are concerned, both Lithuania and Latvia have far more sort of prominent scene as far as left-wing initiatives are concerned. And Estonia is sort of the country which liberalized fastest, which has always been this sort of example of how to undertake neoliberal reforms, of how to implement radical shock therapy, and really demonstrate very, very high growth rates, especially in the short period between 2004 and 2008. This has taken place by almost completely sort of eradicating any spaces for left-wing critique, which is one sort of important thing to keep in mind, because ECRA and the far right managed to really talk about the issues that the mainstream parties did not consider as important. For example, the issues of outward migration. The issue, which is closely linked to sort of the demographic crisis in the country of Estonia, where the population is 1.3 million, this is a very massive problem. ECRA also started talking about stagnating wage growth. It also started talking about inequalities and economic inequalities between the core of the European Union and the periphery of the European Union. So in a sense, it was talking about sort of things that the left should be really paying attention to. It managed to sort of capitalize on obviously all forms of sort of nationalist, racist gibberish by advocating ideas about the necessity to establish actually a strong welfare state, which touches upon what Owen has said about libertarianism. ECRA has a position that really sort of calls for the establishment of a strong welfare state, but obviously based on the principles of welfare chauvinism. So it's only the welfare state for Estonians, but not for others. So it really spoke about some of these things that perhaps social democratic left or even radical left could sort of focus on. In addition to that, what is important to mention as well is that, and this relates to some of the commentary that was sort of put forward here. So it is important to think as to what is happening during post-communist transformation, especially in the Baltic states, which become the examples of sort of more or less successful implementation of radical shock therapy, at least within the circles of the international financial institutions, advisors, etc., Western advisors. So the language of class is completely delegitimized. The language of class, to explain disenfranchisement, to explain sort of like disparities as far as the regional disparities are concerned, as far as income wealth disparities are concerned, it is completely delegitimized for understandable reasons, perhaps, at least in the Baltic states. So class is associated with Marxism-Leninism. It's associated with a specific kind of political economy, which has to be completely forgotten and eradicated from all social sciences in order for sort of a successful transition to take place. And there are sort of major implications behind this move. So the collective identity that becomes dominant and which becomes a reference point is sort of a nationalist identity, but interpreted in very sort of a reactionary terms. And the far right really exploits that and tries to really talk about disenfranchisement, tries to talk about inequalities through the prism of the nation. Now, electorally, this has proven to be a successful sort of a strategy, and sort of a thinking about the upcoming elections in Estonia, which are going to take place in early March, it is very likely that EKRE will come second and perhaps will be part of the coalition government once again. Now, what it is trying to do is basically it's trying to sort of re-establish this previous coalition government, which was there for a brief period of time since March 2019, but with the condition that the prime ministerial post would go to EKRE. So provided that it's going to come second and then will engage in coalition negotiations with the sort of third and fourth most popular parties, then it could potentially, once again reappear on the political scene. So I've only managed to answer the first sort of a question, and I know that I have to wrap up. I will very briefly say that I'm grateful for Owen's comments and for Andrew's comments, very insightful. Anna, your questions are excellent. Can see if Anna is here. Yeah. So excellent questions. And I think we could perhaps even talk in greater detail about them and perhaps communicate, because clearly there are many sort of common themes as far as Slovenia and Estonia are concerned. Oftentimes, those are actually used as two sort of opposite cases of how transition has taken place, sort of the gradualism of Slovenia versus the radicalism of Estonia. But quite clearly, there are more. There have been sort of more similarities, especially in light of the 2008 global and financial crisis. So I'll leave it here, and then if there are any more questions, then I'm happy to pick up on them.
All right. Yeah, thanks a lot, Jokubas. And yeah, sorry for the short time frame we have in this workshop, but I think it's a crucial discussion, which I think we and you can all continue and pick up on. I think to wrap up, I'll still want to invite you to come to our next workshop, which will be more or less a month from now. I can actually send you the link to the event right here, where it's going to be on the 23rd of February, and the focus will be on agency and the data subject, policy and practices, with Sigrid Kanendisa as our presenter. So yeah, would love to see all of you there again. And yeah, again, thanks a lot to you, Jokubas. Thanks a lot, Yuliya. Thanks a lot, Owen, for these insightful discussions. And yeah, let's continue this. See you all soon.
Thanks a lot. Thank you.
Thank you all. See you soon.
Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you so much. Come again next month. And Jokubas, thank you so much for this great piece. Excellent scholarship. Thank you. It was a real pleasure to read.
Yeah,
Tragic,
thanks.
but interesting.
And thanks, Bern, for sharing.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bern.
See you, Evan.
You'll take
Bye.
care. Have a
Take
good
care.
day, evening.
Have a good evening, everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.